Here, and what I want to do at the end of this debate is just talk personally about that time, 25 years ago, 1998 to 91, when I was here, and then what happened afterwards. I arrived in Cambridge from a Merseyside comprehensive. I had 220 other people in my year at school. 15 of us went on to university. There was no help for anybody to stay on. There was no education, maintenance, allowance. So many of my friends left school at 16, even though they had the talent to go on to university, and sadly added to the unemployment statistics in the Northwest, which at the time was 12%. And after graduating in 1991, I went back to the Northwest and added to that statistic, because there was literally nothing there. Our two great cities, Manchester and Liverpool, were in complete decline. And after spending 6 months of writing letters in search of work but finding nothing, I worked at B&Q for £2 an hour because there was no national minimum wage. I then had to work for free on a local newspaper in Manchester, and in the end left for London to find work. And at that time I was back at home, my constituency where I grew up. They were closing the coal mines at that time. And to see what happened was to witness what Britain was like before New Labour came in, because that's what you've got to think about, ladies and gentlemen. The coal mines were closed overnight. Now, this was the social support system of communities across the north. It was literally taken away overnight with nothing put in place. The entire support structure of the community whipped away. The damage was criminal. Families were left with nothing. And we hear from Andrew, from John, they talk these days of broken Britain. Well, I say to them, they've got a nerve. Because Lee, in 1991, that was broken Britain. And that is what we had to put right. And understandably for these reasons, Britain was a country where there was great social unrest. It was a place where a significant minority of one of the nations of the UK had not voted for the government of the day, and yet that same government used it as a laboratory for its most unpopular policy, the poll tax. So we saw disturbances on the streets of London. Britain of the early 1990s, it was a place where a teenager was killed in cold blood at a South London bus stop for no other reason than he was black. And yet, our country's leading police force turned the other cheek. Racism in our institutions was matched by open expression of racist sentiments at our football grounds, but it wasn't an offence, and nobody did anything about it. Why was it allowed to happen? How did they get away with it? The answer is simple: because they could. There was no Freedom of Information Act. Britain was a divided place where the authorities held all the power. The 1980s was a decade when working class culture and communities, football supporters, trade unionists, they were demonised by parts of the press and the Conservative Party. That was the Britain that New Labour inherited. And it was to change that Britain that I went into politics. I wanted nothing of it. It was a Britain where the single biggest influence on your treatment and your life chances was the postcode of the bed you were born in. Because when Labour came to government in May 1997, public sector debt of a share of GDP was 42.5%. And when we got to 2007, before the crash, it was 36.2%. As Hazel said before, your point is not a valid point. But think of the other things: the national minimum wage, the trebling of overseas aid, the first ever Climate Change Act. We did so many things to change this country for the better. In conclusion, I've never argued we got everything right. Like Lisa, I thought at times we didn't do enough to make Britain more equal, that we didn't speak enough about the 50% of young children who weren't going to university. But the question before you tonight is not whether the Blair and Brown governments got everything right. It is whether they ruined Britain. And I would put it to you that the Britain of 2010 was a better place than the Britain of my youth. Fairer, less divided, more open-minded. Or, in the words of David Cameron on the steps of 10 Downing Street in May 2010, quotes, compared with a decade ago, this country is more open at home and more compassionate abroad. But the clinching piece of evidence is not in anything that I've said tonight. It's not in anything that I've said. The clinching piece of evidence is here in the Conservative Party manifesto of 2010 that kept those increases to the overseas budget, that kept the national minimum wage, that kept the benefits that cut pensioner poverty, that kept the investment in the National Health Service. That is the manifesto that Andrew and John stood on in 2010 because they accepted that New Labour had changed Britain for the better, that they couldn't undo the good things that they have done. That is the evidence that you need to think about tonight that shows everything you've heard from those seats opposite is empty rhetoric. New Labour changed Britain for the better, and this is the proof of it.